Trail and ultra runners, what is going on? What's happening? Welcome to another episode of the Koopcast. As always, I'm your humble host, Coach Jason Koop, and this episode of the podcast is about a topic that is going to be familiar with most trail and ultra runners and runners at large, and that is because it is one of the hottest nutrition topics in the world today, and that is relative energy deficiency in sport, otherwise known by its two acronyms, REDS or RED-S, depending upon where and whom you hear that acronym enunciated. This is a topic that is relatively new, and as the discrepancy in the acronym might actually imply, we're still trying to wrap our heads around the term as athletes and as coaches. REDS is an evolution of what was previously known as the female athlete triad. And while the change in naming convention might seem trite to some, make no mistake that the name change is important to better educate and understand things within this topic. So, to unpack this all and why REDS is so problematic, and in particularly problematic for ultra runners who have a high energy demand in the first place due to their training, on the podcast today, we have Ida Heukra, who originally hails from Finland, was schooled underneath the esteemed Louise Burke in Australia, and now finds herself working for the REDS working group for Canadian high performance sport, where they have this extremely compelling project that is currently underway, where they're trying to educate athletes, coaches, and support staff, including parents, on REDS, as well as gather information from the athletes themselves to determine best practices. Of particular note during this podcast, one of the things I wanted to explore was this confluence between relative energy deficiency, low energy availability, which I've done a podcast on that previously, and I'll link that up in the show notes, and low carbohydrate availability, and figure out which one of these could potentially be a trigger for any of the negative outcomes associated with relative energy deficiency. So, with that as a bit of a backdrop, I'm going to get right out of the way. Here's my conversation all about REDS with Ida Heukra. I'm glad you could actually finally come on the podcast. I remember when I originally reached out to you, it was kind of underneath a different context, and I think you're actually working with Louise Burke's group. Is that correct?
I was with Lois from 2016 or 2015 almost until 2020. So I was there, but then I spent 6 months in Finland after that before coming to Canada. But I've been in Canada for 18 months now. So, but yeah, definitely a long time with Lois.
So I think it just goes to speak. Sometimes I reach out to these guests and it takes forever to schedule everything. So I'm glad we could bring you back on. I think to start out with, something for the listeners to kind of get to know you a little bit better is how you initially started out with the Australian Institute for Sport and then relocated to Canada, and what you were involved with during that transition.
Yes, I guess I'm originally from Finland, and I did my master's in exercise physiology at the University of Jyväskylä in Finland. And then I went to Australia to do a PhD with Professor Louise Burke, and also John Hawley and Dr. Trent Stellingwerf, who I work with now. He was assistant supervisor for the PhD. But I went to Australia in 2016. I stayed almost 4 years, did my PhD there. It was an amazing experience. I got to be a part of a lot of the research going on at the Australian Institute of Sport, and it's amazing opportunity really with the facilities you have over there. So all the supernova studies are from the AIS, and currently Louise is with ACU's Australian Catholic University, but they continue similar research. And I left the AIS or ACU's Australia early 2020. I had plans to come to Canada. We had applications and everything underway, but with COVID and all that stuff, I spent 6 months in Finland working kind of as a combined research practice role with 3 different institutions. So there was University of Jyväskylä, there's the Helsinki Metropolitan Sports Academy, and then the Research Institute for Olympic Sports. So that was 6-month kind of transition period, which was a cool change from being a PhD student to doing something different. And then 18 months ago, I arrived in Canada, and now I work as a postdoc fellow with Dr. Trent Stellingwerff and his team.
That's a really good pedigree, and I think it kind of goes without saying, but the listeners should kind of understand that is a lot of high level expertise that you have had the opportunity to work with, and that type of expertise to continually be under like all of those different mentors for the period of time that you've been working with them, it's kind of irreplaceable. I mean, you get so much experience working with those experienced people that it's like I said, it's a really cool background, one that I'm sure you are very appreciative of, but it actually shows up in your work a lot as well.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. And it's definitely I feel really lucky that I kind of, not by accident, but kind of just, I didn't want to go to Australia, and then things kind of just, it was a much better experience than I had even thought it could be. So I'm feel really lucky that I was able to have that opportunity, and then, to come here. It's been awesome. So just, I couldn't be happier with those choices, really. I wouldn't change anything going back. So definitely feeling really lucky.
Good for you. I feel like 10 or 20 years from now, like you're going to be the person you're going to be one of the people that are kind of at the top of the pile when we start to talk about things in sports science. So one of the topic du jour today is we're going to talk about RED-S, and this has been a really cool topic that's come up recently in sports science, and in particular endurance sports. I think that to kick things off, we've got to have a little bit of a history lesson and how this acronym kind of came about, and why this current transition from what this like set of conditions was known as previously. Why is the vocabulary important on this? So since you've been at the forefront, can you kind of take the listeners through this transition first, and then we're going to get into some like practical aspects of it?
Definitely. So it's always good to go back. So I guess if we go way back, around 35 years ago, it was discovered that female athletes with eating disorders or disordered eating behavior also showed symptoms of amenorrhea, so lack of periods or regular periods. And these individuals also often showed poor bone mineral density. So, and then researchers kind of combined this syndrome into female athlete triad. So there's the bone, there's the menstrual cycle, and then the eating disorder category. And they had the first consensus statement in the 1990s. It was further developed in 2007 when the experts realized that it's actually a continuum from health to disease. So the athlete can have the extreme conditions of eating disorders, amenorrhea, and osteoporosis, but they can also have some mild menstrual disturbances or some poor but not clinically osteoporosis, so poor bone mineral density. They can also have disordered eating behaviors, so some kind of orthorexia or some issues with dietary intake, but not anorexia to speak with. They also realized that low energy availability is the underlying condition behind this syndrome. And what low energy availability means is when we talk about energy availability, it refers to the energy intake minus exercise energy expenditure, and it's factored for fat-free mass. So it's the energy available after exercise training for other body systems to be used. And the concept is based on Professor Enlog's studies from 30 to 20 years ago. And she had a lot of lab-based, really clinical and well-designed studies in sedentary females, usually 4 to 5 days of duration. And they tested different levels of energy availability from 45 calories per kilo fat-free mass down all the way to 10 calories per kilo fat-free mass, and how those different energy availability levels affect several hormones or bone marker concentrations of females. And they showed that when energy availability goes down, those markers also get impaired. So markers of hormones, several reproductive or metabolic hormones go down, cortisol goes up, markers of bone formation go down, markers of bone resorption go up. So several detrimental effects appear, and they defined the threshold of energy availability in these sedentary females as 30 calories per kilo fat-free mass, but with some markers showing impairments at higher levels and with some markers showing impairments at lower levels. They also did studies with comparisons of diet versus exercise-induced low energy availability, but we can go to that later on. But basically, those studies formed the foundation of low energy availability being the underlying cause for the symptoms of the female athlete triad. And then I guess in 2014, when REDS, so relative energy deficiency in sport, was formed, it was for several reasons. One of the reasons was to include males in the concept as well, because it was realized that male athletes do suffer from the effects of low energy availability. Maybe not to the same extent as female athletes. Females may definitely be more susceptible to the effects of low energy availability, but male athletes do definitely also suffer from the consequences of low energy availability. It was also to acknowledge the fact that there's other body systems involved or affected by low energy availability, not just the bone and the reproductive system. But the same thing as with the triad, low energy availability was acknowledged as the underlying factor for the development of REDS. And the REDS, if you look at the wheels, it still includes the triad as a component there, but just wants to emphasize the fact that it's a much broader syndrome than just the triad.
Yeah, and what's interesting and pervasive throughout that entire history is that low energy availability seems to be kind of at the linchpin of everything. It almost seems to be like the start point to which all of these different things emanate. And I know that your group in Canada actually has a working group that is starting to study relative energy deficiency in sport and try to understand it a little bit better. Can you explain to the listeners like what that working group is like and what things that y'all are trying to uncover?
Yes, I was really fortunate to join the group when I came to Canada. It was started a year before I arrived here, but there's several goals or aims of the group. One is definitely education and increasing the awareness of REDS among athletes, but also the support staff, so coaches, physios, anyone really, parents, because we know that some of the outcomes of REDS or prolonged low energy availability, such as impaired bone density, can be really difficult to reverse. Some of them might be even irreversible. So prevention is definitely key. And to prevent something, we need to increase the awareness. So one of the goals of the group has been to develop an education module on REDS, and that should be almost ready to be online in the next month or two, I suppose. But then alongside that, we've got several research projects going on around the topic of REDS. And one of the studies is a postdoc study that I'm working on with leading the study with Dr. Trent Stellingberg, and that's a pan-Canadian kind of a multi-center research study where the main goal is we screen athletes for different symptoms of potential symptoms of Rett. So we've got an online survey, we do bone density scans, we look at several blood markers of hormones, and we do resting metabolic rate testing. So all of the potential outcomes or symptoms of Rett, we try to screen athletes for those symptoms, and hopefully towards the end of the study, we'll be able to have a better idea of what kinds of symptoms should we be looking for when we screen athletes for Rett, to be able to kind of filter through the athletes with potential risk factors early on, to then not let the longevity develop into a full-blown Rett case.
I'm interested to know a little bit more about this, since you're interfacing with such a broad array of people that are in the athletic space. I mean, you mentioned athletes, coaches, researchers, parents, that you guys are trying to educate and trying to really get in front of the problem before it actually starts to manifest itself into something that's a big issue. Because as you mentioned, the consequences can actually last years and and in some cases can be irreversible. So it's definitely a problem worth getting in front of versus trying to like course correct all the time. But I'm curious to know, when you as you are getting in front of all these different groups of people that interface with athletes in different ways, what are some of like the main themes that you are seeing when you're trying to educate these people, and how can like the listeners take that away into something like tangible? Like, what are like the main pieces of education that you're trying to impart on those groups?
Well, the education is and the increasing of awareness is something we are only starting to work on now. So I didn't have experience from working with this working group from like what it actually looks like, but some of the things that definitely are not really an issue, but just a theme that really arises often is several misconceptions among athletes and coaches and even physicians. So some of the athletes and even physicians and coaches might still think that a female athlete who misses their period, that's a normal sign of heavy training. And we know that's not true, but that's something they might even think, if I miss my period, that's awesome. Now I know that I train hard enough and I can just keep going, which is not true, but most of the people still seem to think that way. Another misconception that's quite common is, if I don't have an eating disorder, then I can't have longevity, and that's also not true. So you don't have to have eating disorder or disordered eating behavior to develop Rett's. Some of the Rett's cases might be elite male heavyweight rowers or soccer players who just expend so much that even though they really eat a lot, they just can't keep up with the expenditures.
And this is the issue in ultramarathon running, right? That I
Definitely.
always come back to with registered dietitians and people in the space, is it's such an energetically intensive sport that it's hard to keep up with the caloric demands, kind of from two different angles, right? One is the sheer number of just the sheer number of calories that you have to consume when you're training heavily, but also but also, and I would say even more problematic than that for athletes to figure out and coaches like myself to figure out, is kind of the daily discrepancy of caloric expenditure that athletes go through. Not that it's a bank balance that you have to, pay back every hour or something like that, but when you have like a 10,000 kilojoule day followed by a 2,500 or 2,500 kilojoule day, that fivefold or fourfold discrepancy in caloric expenditure when you're kind of cycling in and cycling out of that is actually kind of a problematic thing for a lot of athletes to kind of to get a grip on. And a lot of the times ends up slowly manifesting itself in this low energy availability. It's not one day, but it's several days and several weeks that all of a sudden kind of like dogpile upon an athlete, and before they know it, they're in a real pickle, and it takes a long time to recover from that.
That's a good point, and I think like we still don't know enough of how much the kind of the small like the short term launch
Yeah.
availability will affect. But we do think that if you across a week or 2 weeks average with optimal or okay levels of energy availability, they'll mitigate the effects of 1 or 2 days of dip when you have really low energy availability. I guess the issue is with athletes, like you just mentioned, if you have a really big training day, you can't keep up with the levels of energy needs. And then the next day, if you're not hungry or you try to just match the rest day or low activity day energy requirements, then you will develop the long-term launch availability.
Yeah, and that's the counsel that we've been trying to relay to athletes, is that you have to think about things on like a, and I don't know the answer to this either. Maybe you kind of illuminated this we don't really know, right, what the short-term effects actually are. From a pragmatic perspective, I've always kind of used like a 3 or 4 day rolling average. Like if we look at that and we try to balance it on a 3 or 4 day rolling average, then everything tends to work out. But that's just me kind of guessing, and all full admission. Like I don't think that that's the perfect answer, nor has science really uncovered it.
I think like I'll definitely go with something like that. We had a field study with athletes, which always when you try to estimate or calculate energy availability,
Yeah.
it's really tricky. But what we did was with elite cyclists over 8 days, where they had 4 days of racing, we recorded all the food intake and then got really accurate estimates of energy expenditure from power meters. And those cyclists on the 4 racing days, their energy availability was almost 0 or 5, like super low. But then on resting days or training days in between, energy availability was maybe 60 or 55. So they averaged over the whole 8 day period around 36 calories per kilo of fat free mass, which is above the threshold. And the threshold has been established for females. So for males, the threshold might actually be lower. But what we found was over that 8 day field study period, the hormones and everything, like the levels stayed fine. So we think that if you average over a week or so period, a longer term energy availability that's normal or optimal, then those 1 or 2 day really low levels should be manageable.
Yeah, I know the study that you're referencing, and interestingly enough, we use that and then some very similar research in some of the training protocols that we use, particularly when we're designing like camps for athletes. So for normal athletes, right, they can get away for like a 3 or 4 day camp, and they
Mm,
can increase their training volume by usually threefold, right? Which is a typical
yeah,
cycling stage race type of setup. You race for 3 or 4 days in a row, so they're all very, very hard. You can't keep up with energy demands, but then you can kind of make it up on the back end. So it's interesting to see all of these things kind of confluence, right? What we see in the
yeah.
field from a training perspective, but also what gets illuminated from the races when we're looking at it in this cycling stage racing concept. It's so funny that you just mentioned that, because I was going over that with one of my colleagues just the other day.
That's so cool. That's awesome.
I want to talk about another piece of research and really some commentary that you guys have put out in the space, and that's this overlap that we've already really alluded to with overtraining syndrome and REDS and low energy availability, which always gets put into like this sports science goulash that we try to unwind. And I'm going to leave a link in the show notes to the paper itself. I think it's one of those papers that's really accessible for normal people to understand. So if people want to go check it out, and they can absolutely read it. But I want to know what your like your takeaways from this paper. Well, first we can kind of talk about the construction of it, right? And why this paper is important and why you decided to like tackle this enormous this enormous topic and kind of basically unwind all of these different pathways that get entangled.
Yeah, so the paper you're referring to is the I guess the discussion we had over overtraining syndrome in rats and if they are originated from the same lunge availability, and if sometimes they might be confused. So overtraining syndrome might be confused as overtraining when it's actually under fueling. So the review we wrote is a narrative review. So it's not if you do a systematic meta-analysis, it's a much more strict protocol you have to follow. A narrative review can be a bit more freely and creatively written, I guess. But the main idea there was we still don't know with overtraining syndrome how to diagnose. It's a diagnosis of exclusion. You exclude clinically every condition possible, even poor dietary intakes, and then you come up with this must be overtraining if the athlete is tired and poorly performing or performance is decreasing. And although overtraining syndrome is a lot older concept than Reds, currently Reds is also a similar kind of diagnosis of exclusion almost, that you exclude other clinical conditions and then you come up with potential Reds. But what's interesting with both of these, so with overtraining, we usually think that it's the increase in training load or energy expenditure that then the athlete can't really handle, and it develops into poor adaptation and increased fatigue. And then with Reds, it's more often the lack of, or it is lack of energy available, but it can be as a result of increased training loads or increased exercise energy expenditure or decrease in energy intake, or a combination of both, such as an imbalance, which leads to lunge availability. So that was the main, I guess, underlying idea or hypothesis behind the review, and how we kind of started working towards it was we went through all the studies that we could find. You can't really find actual overtraining interventions. It's ethically not okay to drive people into that state, but you can find studies of intensive training loads, which then lead to some sort of functional overreaching, so which is less severe than overtraining syndrome. So we went through all the literature and all the studies we could find that fit the training overload topic. Mostly this is endurance-based research or endurance training. And then with all the studies, or we only chose studies that also reported energy or dietary intakes to calculate energy intake and possibly energy availability. I think we had two studies who did the energy availability calculations in the paper, but with the rest, we tried to estimate energy availability.
That's really hard. Like, I just want to point that out. Like you're just going through this, like, oh, we just tried to estimate. It's like, that's really freaking hard to do. Like, I appreciate you guys going to those lengths to try to figure that out.
It's definitely, it was a ton of work, but it was really cool as well to go through. And then especially when you start going through and then you actually start finding the trends there being, oh, actually most of these intervention groups, this paper says that it's overreaching or poor training adaptation because the overload, they also seem to have poor energy availability or poor carbohydrate availability, or both. So it was a really cool, and that was something we had to do to give some basis for the hypothesis we had originally. And when going through the studies, we could show a link there. It was a ton of work, but it was really cool to find what we anticipated we might find going through the papers. So I guess eventually we found 21 papers that had some sort of a training overload intervention or observation, and that also reported energy intakes for us to be able to calculate or estimate energy availability differences between groups or from pre to post. And of the 21 papers we found, 18 papers did show poor energy availability or poor carbohydrate availability in either the intervention group or then from pre to post. So at the same time as they showed some sort of overtraining or overreaching, there was a dietary component present, which then gave us some further support for the hypothesis that maybe at least some of the overtraining or overreaching cases might actually be REDs or a result of low energy availability. And maybe if we focused on the fueling part of the equation during the heavy overload, some of the cases might actually be fine. They wouldn't be showing the symptoms that they did in those studies.
Well, and I think here's the crux of it, and the analysis that you did really illuminates this very well. Is that we use this term overtraining syndrome in an incorrect fashion because it's not actually training that is over in almost all cases. Certainly you can have too much training, but that's very, very, very rare. Normally what results in this bag of symptoms that you try to that you try to identify with an athlete is that they're either, as you started out by saying, they're either under recovering or under fueling, which is the root cause of things. If it were truly overtraining, you can simply remove the training and they would get better, but we don't actually see that in almost all cases. They actually need to increase their energy intake in order to course correct the symptoms, which is exactly what you were describing.
Definitely. That's totally true. I think in Finnish, we had a term for overtraining. It's something like being over or like beyond good shape, which is totally inaccurate. But yeah. So I definitely agree with that. The terminology can be misleading.
Yeah, I'll go back to, I'm going to link this up in the show notes too. Like one of my very first podcasts with my coaching colleague Corinne Malcolm, we tried to unpack this vocabulary, and I think it's when the everyday athlete comes across that terminology, in their mind what they're thinking is, okay, I have to avoid training too much, but that's normally not the case. They have to avoid under fueling or avoid low energy availability kind of first and foremost, because that's the first step in the whole process. I want to get to this. I want to get to kind of another topic that that you guys were trying to unwind here, and that's this confluence of low energy availability or low carbohydrate availability. And this is as you're, as you're very well aware of, working with Luis's group, especially around the time that you were working with them, low carbohydrate and ketogenic diets come up in the sports science space all of the time. I think this is like my fourth round, now that I've been coaching for a long time now, that low carbohydrate diets seem to like rise in popularity, and those waves will kind of continue in the future. And so it becomes a popular topic because a lot of athletes want to undertake that type of dietary pattern for whatever reason. But I'd like for you to try to describe a little bit more about what you're thinking, or what some of the research actually says about which becomes more problematic. Is it actually the total energy availability, or is it specifically the carbohydrate availability that can cause this cascade of issues?
It's a really good question. I think my short answer is we don't know, but to hypothesize some of the findings or some of the evidence we do have is carbohydrate definitely has a role that might be energy independent, especially with some pathways we know with bone markers when you look at them in relation to different dietary or exercise interventions. Sometimes the lack of carbohydrate is a specific cause of impairment in those markers. We also know that some of the hormones LH, so luteinizing hormone, T3, which is a thyroid hormone, and then leptin. So those reproductive and metabolic hormones might be especially susceptible to lack of carbohydrate fuel, but it doesn't mean that the energy availability is irrelevant. It just means that carbohydrate is the additional factor there that might influence those adaptations, I guess, to different dietary conditions. So I wouldn't say that a high carbohydrate, very low energy availability diet would cause no issues, but we know that carbohydrate is important, not just for obviously for training and racing quality as a fuel for the activity, but also the hormones and the health components in there.
Yeah, and the interesting part of that is it seems to be, as you mentioned, with some of these markers, and some of the research that you did is very particular to bone health, that it seems to be low carbohydrate availability seems to be problematic to that, independent of the total energy availability, meaning you have enough total energy to cover your energy expenditure. But if there's a low carbohydrate, if there's a low carbohydrate condition, it still tends to be problematic.
Yeah, and it's definitely like the whole, is it the energy availability or is it the carbohydrate or a combination of both? Can you kind of save some of the consequences of low energy availability if you focus on higher carbohydrate? That's definitely one of the key research areas for the future that we need to explore more. But we know from studies of, as I mentioned, analogs, she showed that some of the impairments to hormones might be due to lack of carbohydrate, as opposed to just lack of energy availability. The more recent studies in bone show the same trend, and it's kind of like the last, as you mentioned, the ketogenic diets they come and go, but for athletes to understand that carbohydrates have a role beyond the exercise performance would be really, really useful in the current world where carbohydrates seem to be demonized a lot more often than fat or proteins.
Well, and that we get caught up in the endurance space, and particularly in the ultramarathon space, with pigeonholing carbohydrates to gels and, chewables and sports nutrition products, right? But the fact that they serve a role outside of simply providing you energy while you're locomoting or cycling or running or whatever it is, I think that's what the research is actually starting to uncover. That's more important, is that they serve these biochemical roles in along a lot of different pathways that are outside of quote unquote energy production, right? Which is what we typically think about when we think about consuming carbohydrates for.
No, I definitely agree with that.
You just mentioned this a second ago in terms of what the future holds. So you have this complicated, not only vocabulary, but all of these pathways dealing with energy deficiency, low energy availability, low carbohydrate availability. Where personally do you want to see the research go from here? Like, what questions you want to kind of continually uncover that you think will be beneficial for athletes?
So many different directions. Honestly, I feel like there's 10 or 20 years worth of research to be done. One of them, which is going back to the REDS component, is getting a better idea of how to screen athletes for REDS, to get a hold of the athletes early on and to prevent the long-term negative consequences. And to do that, we need to know what symptoms to look for. That's something we hopefully will know in a couple of years' time when our study, but also other research around the world has been finished. But that's definitely one of the big goals for the next couple of years. But then when we go back to the low energy availability or low carbohydrate availability, we have these really well done studies by analogs, which are 4 to 5 days of duration, but we still lack of the knowledge of the time course of changes in several markers as a result of launch availability. So we know what happens in 4 to 5 days, but we know less about what happens in the medium term, so weeks to months, and in the long term. So that would definitely be beneficial, so that we can, as you know, athletes, and especially endurance athletes, do need to modify or periodize body composition. So knowing a safe way to do this without causing long-term impairments would be beneficial. Another theme in terms of launch availability that we still don't know is the dose of launch availability. That's been discussed in the last couple of years a bit. So by dose, we refer to the combination of duration of exposure to launch availability, the frequency. So if it's, as we talked about, every day, every other day, 2 days a week, the magnitude. So is it 30 calories per kilo of fat-free mass per day, or is it 15? And then that in combination with the duration and possible breaks from the launch availability, and finding I guess the best way to do this without causing the impairments to health would be really beneficial. And yes, we also touched the theme of macronutrients, and especially the role of carbohydrate availability in relation to launch availability to maybe prevent those outcomes.
I'm sure you realize this as you're thinking about it and discussing it, but you're picking all the really complicated problems. Like not
Definitely.
not the simple ones. You're picking the preventative problem, which is like to get in front of these things that's always it's the most impactful, right? Because then you don't have to unwind any, any ill effects. But it's also the most difficult problem to solve because it's got a predictive nature to it, right? You're trying to prevent something, and you've got to figure out how you can kind of forecast physiology in a certain way. You're also picking the long term problem, the long term interventions, the long term trials to actually study, which is really problematic because as you increase the duration that you're studying somebody, you run into issues of non-compliance, and it just gets really complicated there. So
Definitely.
I appreciate the audacity of trying to figure out all those things, because one, it's important because we've seen a lot of athletes' careers kind of get unwound unnecessarily by some of these issues. But more importantly, it impacts health for not only elite athletes but everyday athletes.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And with the health component, sometimes when you talk to athletes, and especially younger athletes, and this maybe goes to the education and prevention, but in the early days or previously, if you were a female athlete and you missed your period, you might talk to the physician or someone, and then be told that you need to get your period back because otherwise you will get osteoporosis when you're 60 years old. And that's something the young female athlete doesn't really care about. So definitely also talking about health, you need to know what language to use, and what kinds of things to refer to convince the athlete and the coach that it's important right now and not just 50 years down the track.
Yeah, it's super important because the people surrounding those athletes, and I've seen that in a high performance context, I can't tell you how many times, it's important to put that 20-year lens on, and not just the proverbial 4-year Olympic cycle or 2-year Olympic cycle or whatever, two-year world championship Olympic cycle. Like we tend to look through things. You really have to look out for the next 20, 30, 40 years of a person first, because they're not incongruent in almost all cases. And then you can focus on the performance second, health first, performance second, like always. And all too often that gets kind of like lost in the shuffle when we talk about, how to optimize our diets and optimize our performance and things like that. We tend to take some shortcuts that might have long-term ill effects.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I totally agree with the health first and performance second. I think that's the motto of the Norwegian sports institute or Olympiad Open. But also think it's important to highlight to the athletes and coaches that it's not health and performance kind of separate, but they are connected. So they would understand that health does precede performance, and then maybe that way, and that's part of the education and prevention component to increasing the awareness that they go hand in hand, might motivate the athletes to focus on both.
Yeah, 100%. We're in 100% alignment there. Well, I'm very appreciative of your work. I can't wait to see what comes out of the group there. For the listeners out there that want to learn a little bit more about what you and the group up there in Canada is doing, where can you direct them to? And I'll link all this stuff up in the show notes as well.
I think at this point, Twitter is always a good place to follow. There's so many people involved in the study. It's not just me and Trent. But yeah, I might send links to you to those key websites or people to follow, and then that might be a good place to start.
Excellent. I'll have all of those in the show notes. And for the people listening, go check out the paper. It's a super important one. And follow this group out of Canada. You guys are doing great work out there. I appreciate you coming out on the podcast, and I hope to bring you back once you can once you figure out all the complexities of these future studies that you want to tackle. I hope we can bring you back on the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure.
All right, folks. There you have it. There you go. Much thanks to Ida for coming on the podcast today. Really appreciate the effort that her and the entire team up in Canada has been putting forth for this effort to educate the public on these issues with RED-S and inform athletes and coaches alike. Makes my job a whole heck of a lot easier when I have smart people like Ida working on these types of issues. Also appreciate the heck out of all of the listeners out there. As I have reiterated from the onset of this podcast has no sponsors, no endorsements. I do it simply as a community service, and you can help out by sharing this podcast, giving it a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. And really, if you like it, just send me a direct message via social media and tell me what topics you would like to see coming up in the future. That is it for today, folks. And as always, we will see you out on the trails.